In 1650 Japan, 90% of the population worked the land, and most of them never tasted a single grain of white rice their entire lives. Before the sun touched the horizon, Kenji was already awake, not by choice, but because hunger and duty left no room for rest. His morning meal was the same as yesterday, and the day before that. A gray paste of barley mixed with radish scraps, boiled into something barely worth calling food. By the time sunrise cracked over the mountains of Niigata, Kenji had already walked 2 kilometers to reach the paddies, barefoot, through mud and cold water. The rice he planted, tended, and harvested was not his. Every grain of white rice belonged to the daimyo, the feudal lord whose castle loomed over the valley like a permanent threat. Under the Tokugawa system, farmers were ranked second in the social hierarchy, above merchants and artisans on paper. But on the ground, they were treated as little more than livestock. Kenji worked from first light to last light, 12 to 14 hours every single day, through summer heat that boiled the paddy water and winter cold that cracked skin to the bone. The daimyo's domain produced thousands of koku of rice each harvest season, yet the men and women who grew it lived on the absolute edge of starvation, year after year. Kenji's family of 5 survived on approximately 1 koku of rice per year, roughly 150 kilograms after taxes. That is less than 100 grams of grain per person, per day. And the cruelest part, the grain Kenji was forbidden to eat was piling up in the Lord's storehouse right now. White, gleaming, perfect rice that his hands alone had grown. Tax collection day came twice a year. Officials arrived with measuring boxes and ledgers, and what they recorded was final. There was no negotiation, no appeal, no mercy. 50 to 60% of everything Kenji harvested was taken immediately. A bad harvest year meant the same percentage was still demanded, even if it left his children with nothing. But the tax was only one threat. Every time a samurai walked the village road, farmers were required to bow immediately, completely, and without hesitation. Failure had consequences. The law was called Kirisute-gomen. It gave samurai the legal right to cut down any commoner who they judged to be disrespectful on the spot, without trial, without consequence. Kenji knew this, every farmer knew this, so they bowed, they starved, they worked, and they survived one harvest, one prayer, one day at a time. Harvest season arrived in October. For most people, autumn means abundance. For Kenji, it meant the most brutal month of the year, the month everything was taken away. The measuring boxes called masu were the most feared objects in any farming village when officials pulled them out. Every farmer's stomach dropped, because the math never worked in their favor. Officials measured, officials recorded, and when they declared 60% of Kenji's harvest belonged to the Lord, there was no court to appeal to, no document to challenge, no voice to raise. That evening, Kenji returned home to what remained. His wife Hana had already prepared dinner, the same dinner they had eaten for 300 days running. On the low table sat 3 bowls of mugi-meshi barley mixed with millet and shredded radish, boiled into a gray, sticky paste. This was dinner. This was also breakfast. This was every meal. No meat, no fish, no vegetables beyond what scraps could be foraged or bartered. Protein came from miso paste, fermented soybean, dissolved in water so thin it was barely soup. Now here is what most people believe, and what every history textbook gets completely wrong. People assume Edo-period farmers ate rice. They did not. They grew it, but they could not eat it. White rice in Edo Japan was currency. It was the unit of tax, the measure of a lord's power, the salary of samurai. Farmers who ate it were effectively stealing from the government. Records from Edo-period domain inspections show farmers caught eating white rice could face punishment, additional taxation, or forced labor. The grain they grew was legally not theirs to consume. Some domain lords went further. Edicts recorded in historical archives explicitly told farmers, eat millet, eat barley, Eat roots, do not waste rice on your stomach. Rice is for the Lord. So what did Kenji actually eat? Historians call it the survival diet. Barley, millet, buckwheat, radish, pickled vegetables, and whatever wild plants or insects could supplement the daily ration. In years when the harvest failed, drought, flood, or frost, there was no safety net, no government relief, no stored reserves for farmers. They simply starved. Historical records confirm mass famine events throughout the Edo period. The Tenmei famine of 1782 to 1788 killed between 300,000 and 1 million people across northern Japan. Niigata, Kenji's region, was among the hardest hit. Entire villages simply disappeared. Yet despite all of this, the starvation rations, the crushing taxes, the constant threat of the sword above their heads, farmers like Kenji did not revolt. Not because they accepted it, but because they could not afford to fail. Because if Kenji stopped working, his children starved. If he protested, he risked the sword. The system was designed so that survival itself demanded absolute compliance. That was the true genius and horror of the Edo order. There was a law in Edo Japan that most modern people have never heard of. It was called Kirisute-gomen, and it gave samurai the legal authority to execute any commoner they judged disrespectful, on the spot. Kirisute-gomen literally translates to cut down and leave. A samurai who felt insulted even by something as small as eye contact, a slow bow, or an accidental bump was within his rights to draw and kill. For Kenji, every encounter with a samurai on the road was a survival test. The rules were unwritten but absolute. Bow immediately, bow deeply, do not speak, do not make eye contact, do not move until they pass. Historical records document cases where farmers were cut down for bowing too slowly, for raising their eyes at the wrong moment, for standing upright when a mounted samurai passed. Death came without warning and without justice. At night, Kenji taught his children the rules of survival. Not reading, not writing, not history or philosophy. The lessons were simple: bow fast, speak low, never look up, and never, ever anger a man with a sword. The samurai class represented less than 10% of Japan's population. Yet through the Kirisute-gomen law and the rigid Confucian hierarchy enforced by the Tokugawa Shogunate, they controlled everything. One afternoon in late autumn, Kenji was carrying a bundle of harvested rice stalks along the village road when he heard it. The sound every farmer dreaded most, the heavy rhythm of armored footsteps approaching from behind. He had seconds to decide: drop the bundle and bow, or keep walking and be seen as insolent. His hands were shaking. His knees were already bending before his mind had finished the thought. The bundle hit the dirt. Kenji dropped to both knees, forehead pressed to the ground, arms flat, palms open. He did not breathe. He did not move. He waited, face in the dust, for the footsteps to pass. When the footsteps finally faded, Kenji raised his head slowly from the dirt. He was alive. He gathered his scattered bundle, stood, and kept walking. That was victory. That was what survival looked like in 1650 Japan. This was not a rare event. This was Tuesday. This was every week of every month of every year of Kenji's life. The psychological weight of living under that constant lethal threat is almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. Edo-period peasants developed a concept called mura, the village collective. Because individual survival was nearly impossible, farmers pooled labor, shared tools, and looked out for one another. Community was the only safety net they had. When one family's harvest failed, neighbors brought what little they could spare. When a farmer fell ill during planting season, the village worked his field. Not out of charity, out of the understanding that next season it could be them. The Edo period lasted 265 years, from 1603 to 1868. For most of those years, in most of those villages, Men like Kenji lived and died within a 5-kilometer radius of where they were born. The world outside was not for them. Yet, within those invisible walls, within the crushing weight of taxes and swords and starvation rations, something endured. Not just survival, something quieter, something the feudal lords never managed to tax away completely. As the sun began to set over the rice paddies of Niigata, Kenji's day was not over. There were bundles to stack, irrigation channels to close, tools to clean, and a family to feed before darkness made everything impossible. The irrigation channels had to be adjusted each evening by hand. One wrong setting, and the paddy section could flood or dry overnight, destroying weeks of growth. Every detail required attention. Exhaustion was not an acceptable excuse. By the time Kenji returned home, the children were already asleep on their straw mats. His wife had kept a small portion of mugi-meshi warm over the dying fire. He ate alone, in silence, too tired even to taste it. He had worked approximately 14 hours that day. He had consumed fewer than 1,500 calories. He had bowed to a samurai, surrendered 60% of his harvest, and taught his children how to survive by staying invisible. And tomorrow, before sunrise, he would do it all again. Not because he chose to, not because he believed in the system, but because the alternative for him, for Hana, for his children was death. This is the history that textbooks skip. Not the shoguns, not the castles, not the samurai codes of honor. The history of the 90%, the ones who fed the empire and received nothing in return but the right to keep breathing. The Tokugawa Shogunate maintained this system for over 2 centuries by design. Peasants were kept just prosperous enough to survive and reproduce, but never prosperous enough to organize, resist, or dream of anything different. Historians estimate that during the Edo period, the average farming family spent between 60 and 70% of their waking hours in direct agricultural labor. The remaining time was spent on survival tasks, cooking, repairing, gathering, preparing for the next day. And yet, and this is what the records show, and what makes this history so profoundly human, farmers like Kenji still found moments, festivals, songs, rituals tied to planting and harvest that gave the cycle of suffering a thread of meaning. The harvest festival was called Unnamed, a ritual of gratitude to the gods for what little had been spared. Farmers prayed not for wealth, not for freedom, not for justice. They prayed simply for enough to make it one more year. Kenji did not know the name of the shogun who ruled Japan that year. He did not know the political disputes between the great lords. He knew his paddy. He knew his family. He knew the seasons. That was his entire world. Kenji lived, he worked, he bowed, he starved at the edge of death and came back each spring to plant again. He never made it into any history book. No record carries his name. But the rice that fed the samurai, the lords, the shogun, that rice was his. The Edo period is remembered for its art, its philosophy, its samurai culture, its isolation policy, but it was built on the backs of men and women who ate barley porridge, bowed to swords, and worked until their hands could no longer close. History remembers the 1%, the generals, the emperors, the architects of power. But civilization, every civilization, in every era, was fed, built, and sustained by people whose names were never written down. People exactly like Kenji. Kenji's story ended the way it began, in the mud. Before sunrise, with a bowl of barley in a field that was not his. But the world he fed still stands. And now, at least, you know his name.